Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know some people are still trickling in, but we have quite a bit of material to get through today. So I want to go ahead and get started. We are talking about the neurobiology and traumatic impact of sexual violence today. My name is Victoria Riekers, and I am a sexual violence response coordinator at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. So welcome to the webinar. Just a little bit about the coalition. We are the statewide coalition to end sexual and domestic violence for Arizona. Every state and territory in the United States has a coalition that works on sexual violence, domestic violence, or they have one that does both. At our coalition, we provide training and technical assistance to programs and community members. We also have a helpline. The helpline is for victims and survivors of sexual and domestic violence. It's also for advocates to call and anyone who's looking for resources. We also have a public policy department where we work on legislative advocacy, changing laws and advocating for laws that help survivors. And so before we really start, I want to go over some housekeeping. Today we're on Zoom. I'm sure many of you are getting familiar with Zoom as COVID goes on. I want to ask that everyone, when you have a question for today's webinar, if you can use the Q&A function, that's easier for me as a presenter to see than asking questions in the chat. If you ask questions in the chat, that's okay. I'll still be looking out for them, but the Q&A is a little bit easier for me. I also want to let you know this webinar is being recorded. And so just keep that in mind. If you want to ask a question anonymously, you can do that through the Q&A function. You can put your name on anonymous, so that way it's not publicly stated if you're uncomfortable with that. I also want to acknowledge that Zoom bombing in the comments will not be tolerated today. So please make sure we're keeping all our comments respectful. And then if something does come up or something happens, we'll just turn the comment box off. So please know that won't be tolerated. And then finally, at the end of today, we will be completing, we'll have an evaluation. It'll be posted in the chat, and then you'll receive an email about it as well if you miss it. All right, I see that some people are having some issues with sound. And so I saw several people are commenting already, just good morning. So if you can hear me, I would like you to say what the weather is of where you are today. And then if you're having trouble with the sound, you can try connecting to the sound via your phone number instead of with the computer. It could be an issue with your computer's audio. All right. So like I said, my name's Victoria, and I want to say I'm not a scientist. We're talking about the neurobiology of trauma today, but I'm not a scientist. I'm just a nerd. I'm going to try to translate some of the science, some of that hard science of the brain and the body into something that we can use as people working with survivors of sexual violence. I see a lot of people have sunny weather today, which is no surprise because we're in Arizona and it's very hot where I am in Phoenix, so. All right, so before we start, I know we're talking about trauma today, and I just want to take the time to acknowledge the trauma of the past week for the Black community, especially before we get started. It's very important for us to recognize that to end sexual violence, we need to fight against all forms of oppression, including racism and police violence. All right, so what is the neurobiology of trauma? So I have a poll for you all. I want to know, what is your current comfort level with the neurobiology of trauma? All right, so I'm going to give you a few minutes to answer this poll on your screen. All right, it says about 80% of people have answered, so I'm going to end the poll. And it looks like most people are feeling pretty comfortable. Several people are feeling unsure or uncomfortable, so that's great. We're going to really get into some of the nitty-gritty details today. So hopefully by the end, people are in that comfortable, very comfortable range. And if you're not, feel free to reach out to me at any time, and I can talk more in detail with you about the neurobiology of trauma. All right, so what is neurobiology? Neurobiology is the study of the nervous system, how the brain works, and how the brain affects the body. The brain has significant influence on how the body responds to traumatic events like sexual violence and can explain many of the different responses we see in survivors. Before we really get into it, I want to go over just some brain basics, just so that we're all on the same page. I don't know about you, but I was not taught a lot about the brain when I was in school. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't have a science background in education at all, but I am a huge nerd, so hopefully I can translate this. But the first thing I want to talk about is neurons. So the brain is made up of cells called neurons. And these neurons pass information between each other and to the rest of our body, both chemically and electrically. They often fire in groups, and this is often called brain circuitry. Another term we're going to talk about today is neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is all about how the brain learns. There's an expression that's neurons that fire together, wire together. And this just means that over time, the neurons that fire together, they become stronger and they become kind of like a default setting. So our brain creates templates and shortcuts for how to go about our lives to save us time and energy. This is really important to keep in mind because it impacts the way that someone responds to trauma, and it also is about how our brain grows and changes. So it's really important for healing because we can actually rewire our brain when we heal from traumatic events. But this takes time and patience and practice. So we can divide the brain into 3 parts. 2 of those parts are the brainstem and the limbic system, which we're going to call the emotional brain throughout today. So the brainstem controls our basic life functions, eating, sleeping, waking, urinating, defecating, and breathing, right? One way to think about the brainstem is that if a newborn baby can do it, our brainstem controls it. The second part of the emotional brain is the limbic system. The limbic system, also known as the mammal brain, is important for our emotions and for our memory, as well as our stress response. Today, you'll see on the slide that there are several parts that are labeled. And today we're going to be talking about some of these parts like the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the hippocampus. I don't think y'all need to keep track of what all those different parts are, but just keep in mind that they are all part of the emotional brain. The third part of the brain we're going to talk about is the rational brain. The rational brain contains the parts of our brain like the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive function, rational thinking, narrative recall, and just making sense of our world. It's also important to understand timing and time sequence. So there's a lot that happens in the rational brain. Our ability to have empathy for others is also part of the rational brain. And we find in the rational brain, we have mirror neurons. And we're going to talk a little bit about mirror neurons throughout the presentation. But basically, remember the word mirror, right? We see our reflection in a mirror. We imitate each other with a mirror, right? So mirror neurons are what allows us to imitate others, to understand others, and to be in tune with the people around us, right? And so when I talk about being in tune with the people around us, I'm going to use the word attunement. And in the rational brain today, we're really going to talk about the prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. All right, so how does our brain interpret the world? So the emotional brain and the rational brain work together for us to understand the world. And this relationship is really important for how people respond to trauma like sexual violence. So the thalamus, this part of the brain, is part of the brain that helps give us context to our world. It's in the limbic system or the emotional brain. It sends signals to other parts of the brain to respond to what is happening. So the thalamus is just like, hey, this is happening. It sends signals to the amygdala, and it sends signals very quickly. So some people will call this the low road because it's really fast. The amygdala triggers our stress response and gets us ready to respond to danger. The thalamus also sends signals to the medial prefrontal cortex, but it's a lot slower than the signal sent to the amygdala. The medial prefrontal cortex helps us to observe what is happening and make a decision of what to do about it. But because there's a little bit of a delay, you're going to see things like the thalamus says, hey, I smell smoke. Then the amygdala is like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, there's a fire. We got to do something. We got to act. We got to do something right now. And then a few seconds later, the medial prefrontal cortex is like, hold up. We just put the toast in the toaster. The toast is burning. We're safe. There's no fire, right? So that's kind of how that relationship works out. And it feels like, sometimes it can feel like the medial prefrontal cortex takes forever to catch up, but really it's only a few milliseconds. But those few milliseconds are very important. And then finally, we have the autonomic nervous system. This system is based in the brainstem and is part of the emotional brain, right? So reminder, if a newborn baby can do it, it's housed in the brainstem. The autonomic nervous system controls our bodily functions. There are two parts we'll discuss today, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system controls self-preservation functions, and when that side is dominant, we're calm and we're cool. The sympathetic nervous system controls our fight-flight response, and when that side is dominant, that side is dominant when we experience trauma. And sometimes people will call the parasympathetic nervous system the cool brain and the sympathetic nervous system the hot brain. The autonomic nervous system is balanced very carefully. When we're experiencing trauma, it becomes unbalanced and will try to self-correct itself, which explains many of the responses that we see when someone experiences trauma. So we're going to watch a short video to explain this further. Oh. Sorry about that. I don't know why it stopped. I'm going to start it over. So everyone is saying there's no sound to the video, and I'm not sure why that's happening, but I'm going to try opening it in YouTube just to see if that will solve the problem. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, it's still having no sound, so I'm not sure what's happening, but I'm gonna put the link in the chat at the end of the presentation so that you all can view the video on your own time, because I think it's a really useful video to explain the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. All right. Give me one more second to get the PowerPoint presentation back up. Oops. All right. So I'm sorry you can't see the video. We have a few more videos coming up, and then some of them are embedded a slightly different way. So those ones might work. And then we'll skip the ones that are embedded the same way as that one because it probably won't work. So I'm really sorry about that. So we were talking about the parasympathetic, oops. We're talking about the autonomic nervous system, right? And the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So one part of the autonomic nervous system that we want to talk about is also the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is one of the largest nerves in the body, and it's the longest nerve of the autonomic nervous system. It's very important for explaining how bodies respond to trauma and how different body parts are connected to traumatic experiences, right? You'll see that the lungs, the heart, the liver, the stomach, the gut, all of that are connected through the vagus nerve. And when we talk about the traumatic impact, a lot of the physical impacts of sexual violence are related to all these systems that the vagus nerve touches. We're going to talk about polyvagal theory. So this is an idea that the vagus nerve is involved with with three physiological states of the body. So there's the social engagement state, which is run by the ventral vagal complex, the fight or flight state, which is run by the sympathetic nervous system, and the freeze or collapse state, which is run by the dorsal vagal complex. Right, so they're all connected because it's all part of this vagus nerve system. All right, so what happens during trauma? And then keep in mind that what happens to the brain and body during a traumatic event also can happen when someone is triggered. All right, so before a traumatic experience, we're in a calm state, right? We are calm and cool, and we respond and interact with others, right? We build relationships with each other, we talk, but when our parasympathetic nervous system is in charge at this point. It's important to know that when we're in this state, we may be able to call for help or alert others to danger right when a traumatic event or stressful experience begins. But not everyone is able to do this because oftentimes we switch very quickly from being in this calm state to being in a very stressed state. So it's not unusual to not call for danger at all. All right, so a stressful event occurs and the sympathetic nervous system takes over. The sympathetic nervous system controls our fight-flight response. And then a lot starts to happen in the body when this starts. So the amygdala that we talked about before senses a threat, tells the hypothalamus, right, another part of the emotional brain, to activate stress hormones. The pituitary gland activates these stress hormones, and stress hormones are released throughout the body, including cortisol, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, right, more commonly known as adrenaline, and they flood the body and brain. And there's also other hormones in play as well. Stress hormones affect the respiratory and cardiovascular system, so our lungs and our heart. Our breathing increases, and so does our blood pressure. And this is to ready the body for fight or flight. We also have our muscles tense in the body, and this is also to prepare us for fight or flight. The liver produces extra glucose and less bile. And then executive function in the brain becomes impaired. So it becomes difficult to make decisions and to regulate our emotions. For many folks, once the stressful event is over, they'll leave this state and their autonomic nervous system will become regulated again. This could take several hours for the body to completely process and metabolize the stress hormones to become fully regulated. However, when the stressful event continues, or when the brain perceives the event as life-threatening, or when someone cannot escape the stressful event, as often happens during sexual violence, the body continues to respond, right? And the dorsal vagal complex takes over, and we have the collapse or freeze response. Stress hormones continue to be secreted, which overwhelms the body. The heart rate suddenly drops and metabolism and digestion stop, which causes someone to collapse or freeze. So let's take a closer look. We're going to look closer at the sympathetic nervous system response, also the fight-flight response, and we'll look at how to make sense of danger, how we engage the fight-flight response, our emotional response, our executive function response, and how the brain creates templates to respond to danger. So remember from the beginning, the thalamus, amygdala, and medial prefrontal cortex all work together to interpret our world and let us know when we're safe or in danger. However, when we're experiencing something traumatic, the thalamus, which tells us what's happening, it breaks down, and then we're not able to give context to what's happening. The low road to the amygdala, which activates our stress response, that's still functional and it's still fast. The high road to the medial prefrontal cortex, which helps us determine what's happening and how to respond to it, that actually becomes offline. And so the thalamus is still sending signals, but they're not always reaching the medial prefrontal cortex. So we have trouble perceiving what's happening, whether we're in a traumatic event or whether we're triggered by something. When our sympathetic nervous system is engaged, we go into fight-flight mode. This is first activated by all those hormones we just talked about, and we also briefly freeze, so our brains can determine if we should fight back or flee the situation, or if we should stay frozen and experience that temporary paralysis or collapse response. This is more commonly thought of as a deer in the headlights reaction. We pause and then fight, or we pause and then we flee. This process is called the defense cascade. The brain uses past experience and context to determine the course of action. It's not logical or planned out. This happens so we can respond efficiently to threats. If we had to stop and think about every time we were in danger, we wouldn't survive dangerous situations at all. So I have an example of this. A while back, 14 boys tried to mug me when I was traveling. At first I froze, and then my brain decided to fight back, which I will say for the record, I do not recommend that you fight back in those situations, but you don't really have control over what you do in those situations. It was still daylight, and I was in a fairly busy area, and I was also with a friend. So all of this context likely allowed my brain to determine that I was probably safe to fight back. It was not a rational decision or a conscious decision. It was just the decision my brain made in the moment. In the end, it was all fine, and my brain was right. My friend and some passersby chased the boys off. It's really important to remember that survivors don't get to choose how they respond to sexual violence. It's an autonomic, right? An autonomic nervous system response. It's a brain-driven response that's triggered by the release of hormones. In addition to controlling our fight or flight response, the hormones released during trauma affect our emotional response. Hormones like opiates are released that cause emotional and physical numbing. They help us to respond to the overwhelming emotions and physical pain that we're experiencing. They explain why some people may have a frozen or flat, blunted affect, right? They appear to have no emotions or to have very few emotions. They may appear dull or that they don't care. This doesn't mean that they're not feeling emotions or that they don't care. This is just how their brain is responding to the trauma. Other hormones like oxytocin are also released. This hormone makes us feel good and is trying to counteract the negative experiences that we're feeling. This can lead to paradoxical responses like a survivor laughing. So once when I was a volunteer victim advocate, I met a survivor at the hospital. She was doing the forensic exam and she was telling the nurse what had happened to her. The whole time she was laughing. At one point she paused and she said, "It's not funny. I don't know why I'm laughing." But it's these hormones, right? These hormones completely explain why she was laughing, and that was actually a normal response to what she had experienced. So now we're going to talk about decision-making that happens during and after a sexual assault. So remember at the beginning, we talked about the rational brain. So the rational brain, like I said, contains the prefrontal cortex and other parts that are related to high-level thinking. It contains the medial prefrontal cortex, which is important for regulating and understanding our response to threat. And remember, we already talked about how that goes offline. Adrenaline and cortisol, two of the hormones released during a sexual assault, specifically impair the rational brain's functioning. This means that it becomes very difficult for survivors to make decisions, especially decisions that make sense to those who aren't experiencing trauma. For example, one survivor we know, after she experienced sexual assault and her perpetrator fell asleep, she went and hid in the bathroom. Now you might be thinking she could have left the house, and that might have been the rational decision to make at the time, but her rational brain was impaired, and she was thinking the bathroom doors have locks on them, so she could go hide there. When our rational brain becomes impaired, we also lose our ability to balance our emotions. We lose our ability to be attuned or to be in sync with other people, making it difficult to be empathetic. This is why it's difficult to reason with someone who's very upset or angry, and it's also important to remember when someone experiences trauma or when someone becomes triggered. In addition to context and past experience, the brain also creates templates based on how it has handled difficult, fearful, or traumatic situations in the past. This can lead to situations that might not make sense, especially for those who are investigating trauma or investigating sexual violence. This is actually based on neuroplasticity, right? The neurons that wire together fire together. Our brains create shortcuts. So a person may rely on ways that they fended off unwanted advances in the past, right? And their brain may think this is going to work to prevent a sexual violence. For many women, this might mean a soft rejection, right? Many of us are taught or we experience that saying no outright can be dangerous. And so we then go to let them down easy. We might say, "I have a boyfriend, I'm busy, I have to be home soon," instead of no. Even when situations escalate to sexual assault, because people have this template of saying those expressions instead of saying no, and they've worked in the past. All right, now we're going to take a closer look at the dorsal response. So the dorsal response is when the traumatic event occurs and the body continues to secrete stress hormones, and it leads to that collapse response. In this section, we're going to talk about tonic immobility, collapsed immobility, and dissociation, all common responses for sexual violence. All right, so let's look at tonic immobility. Tonic immobility is a freezing or collapse response to trauma where the victim is unable to move or speak. In this response, a person experiences temporary paralysis and sometimes it's known as frozen in fear. A person's limbs may become stiff, but they can still be positioned. Often the onset and offset of tonic immobility is very sudden. 1 second someone is unable to move, and then the next they are, but only once the danger has passed. Many sexual assault victims experience tonic immobility, and this is why many victims say they couldn't say no or they couldn't fight back. All right, we're gonna try another video. And I saw that some of my coworkers have given me some more information to see if I can get the sound to work. So we're gonna try it. Give me 1 second.
Doc showed Mike how to turn the shark upside down. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. Soon, its body becomes catatonic.
I can touch the eyes, bend the dorsal fin, even touch the gills, and there's no resistance.
Oops. All right, so it sounds like the video worked, and then I had some technical problems on my end by ending the PowerPoint. All right, so tonic immobility we could see in sharks, right? That shark couldn't move, and very vulnerable parts of the shark were being touched. And so that happens in sharks. It also happens in humans. The next form of this temporary paralysis is collapsed immobility. So this is also a freezing response, and sometimes it's known as playing possum. Playing possum is a bit of a misnomer because it indicates that someone's making a conscious decision to freeze, but it's not something we have any control over. In this response, there are changes in muscle tone, heart rate, blood pressure, which can cause dizziness and fainting. So my dad actually experienced collapsed immobility. Back in the day, he was, I think, in his 20s, and he was working on the roof of his house, and he fell off the roof. And he always jokes that it didn't hurt at all because he fainted before he hit the ground. I'm sure it hurt afterward, but that collapsed immobility protected him from feeling pain when it happened. So collapsed immobility is slightly different from tonic immobility in a few ways. And one of those ways is that sometimes collapsed immobility can take a little bit longer to wear off. People may seem sluggish and they may slur their words, which sometimes is mistaken for intoxication, but it's actually a completely normal response to trauma. So we have another video. Okay, so I saw that the video was a little choppy for you all. I'm not sure why. It was working for me, but I just paused it before the end since it wasn't really working for you all. But as you might have been able to see, the guy, he passes out on the ride, right? He faints a couple of times. And this is because of that collapsed immobility, right? And then when the video is working, he talks about how he can't feel his legs when he's coming out of it, right? He's slow to come out of this collapsed immobility. 75% of sexual assault victims experience moderate to high levels of paralysis during the assault, right? So this means that 75% experience that dorsal response or that tonic or collapsed immobility response. Now, we know a survivor who was sexually assaulted as a teen, and during the assault, she froze. After it happened, she told herself that if she was ever in that situation again, she would be ready and would fight back. Unfortunately, she was sexually assaulted a few years later. And what do you think happened? She froze again. Because the brain relies on past experience, research is showing that if someone has experienced tonic or collapsed immobility in the past, they're likely to experience it again if in a similar situation. And remember, survivors don't have control over how their body responds, no matter how much they might want to. Dissociation is also a common response to sexual assault. Dissociation is the process of disconnecting from the experience or disconnecting from awareness of what is happening inside of our bodies. It can look like someone is spaced out. They may stare off into space or be unresponsive. Dissociation can happen at the same time as tonic or collapsed immobility, but it doesn't have to. And it's important to keep in mind that it's a protective body-based response to trauma. One thing that's also important to note is that law enforcement often mistaken dissociation for intoxication, lying, or an unwillingness to cooperate. But dissociation is a normal response to trauma. Additionally, the hormones that cause dissociation and some of these other stress responses, they can actually last in the body for up to 96 hours after the assault occurs. So it's especially important when someone is reporting right away or within the first few days of the assault, they may still be in this dissociated state or feeling some of its effects. If they're in this state, they won't have any ability to form a narrative sequence, right? They won't be able to say what happened to them. And this is one of the reasons that it's a really good idea to wait a few sleep cycles before doing any kind of in-depth interview with the survivor. And remember, it takes time for the body to metabolize stress hormones, right? The impairment to the rational brain can last for hours after the assault. And this is not to say that survivors aren't thinking things through or trying to make rational decisions. They are. Their rational brain is just impaired. One example we have is one survivor we know. She was kidnapped and sexually assaulted by someone she had gone on 3 dates with. During the course of this ordeal, at one point, the perpetrator sent her to Starbucks to get him coffee. Now, you might think that a rational decision here would be to report, to go get help, to escape, right? All of that. But despite the fact that she was from a law enforcement family, and despite the fact that there was literally a patrol car outside of the Starbucks, this survivor thought it would be safer to not report just yet because she was still so in fear of the perpetrator and her rational brain was still so impaired. Right? So she was making a decision to protect herself. And it doesn't seem rational to us, but that's okay. That's a totally normal response. Okay. All right, so now I want to illustrate the stress response with a story, kind of taking us through what the stress response looks like. So several years ago, when I was in college, I did a semester in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I lived about 3 blocks away from the beach at the time, and I went almost every day. I was super excited because I'd never been so close to the beach ever in my entire life. However, on the first day I went to the beach, I had a very scary experience. Now, I grew up in the Midwest and had only been to the ocean, I think 2 times before living in Rio. I had taken swimming lessons as a child, and I considered myself to be a confident swimmer. 3 days after I arrived, I met some new people in my program, and we went to the beach. We were hanging out in the water, and we were having a great time. At some point, we all realized we hadn't really been paying very close attention to where we were in the water. The waves and the riptide had taken us further out than we were comfortable with, so we all decided to swim back to shore. Only I realized I couldn't. I tried to swim to shore, but I kept getting taken further and further out. I frantically shouted to my new acquaintances for help, but they'd already made it all the way back to shore. I began struggling to swim. I started rapidly thrashing in the water, doing the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do in a riptide situation. The swimming skills that I thought I had were thrown completely out the window. I wasn't doing any kinds of moves. I was just kind of like treading water and thrashing. I remember thinking to myself at some point during this, there are no lifeguards. Like, oh my God, there's no lifeguards. This, of course, wasn't true. It was a public beach with many lifeguards, and suddenly one appeared. He grabbed me, he told me to calm down, which thankfully I understood enough Portuguese to know, and he swam me back to shore. Afterwards, my new acquaintances asked if I was okay, and I remember laughing about it and saying that I was fine. They said they were really impressed with how I was handling the situation, and then I don't really remember what we did after that. Later that night, I called my mom. I was really worried about calling her because I didn't want her to worry about me, and I was very embarrassed that me, a confident swimmer, had failed so miserably against the riptide. At this point, I was starting to have a really strong emotional reaction to what happened and called her. She actually told me about her own experience getting caught in a riptide, and I felt a lot better. So how does this line up with the trauma response we just discussed? Right, so at the beginning, before I thought I might drown, my ventral vagal complex and my parasympathetic nervous system is in charge. I'm very socially engaged, right? I'm hanging out with new friends. And then I realize the riptide has swept me far out. When I realize I can't swim back, my sympathetic nervous system jumps into action. Before it does, I do yell for help, right? So my social engagement function is still working. But then the sympathetic nervous system fully takes over and I start to panic, right? I start frantically swimming. I lose my rational ability to think through how you're supposed to handle a riptide, right? You're supposed to swim horizontal to the riptide, right? You're not supposed to swim against it. And then I also start thinking irrational thoughts, like there are no lifeguards, even though I was on a public beach and almost all public beaches have lifeguards. Immediately afterward, I laugh a lot, right? And we go to dinner. My new friends are saying, wow, you're handling this so well, right? I'm having unusual emotions. And then later, I call my mom and I have a really strong emotional reaction. However, I do receive really strong social support from my mom. Right, obviously in this example, I didn't experience that dorsal or collapse response. If I had, it would have been a very different story. All right. So now we're going to talk about trauma and memory. So a sexual assault survivor described her perpetrator with sufficient detail that the officers were able to arrest him. When they arrested him, they noticed he had a large tattoo of the New York Yankees on his face, which the victim had not described. The law enforcement officer asked, how could she have missed that? So memory starts with attention. Normally, the prefrontal cortex, part of our rational brain, controls our attention. When the rational brain is impaired, we can't control where we focus our attention. Our stress response has us focus on one of two things, right? We focus on what will help us survive and what will help us cope. What we focus on is called the central details, and what we don't focus on is called peripheral details. For example, let's say that someone is sexually assaulted by a stranger. And then while they're sexually assaulted, they focus on a painting that's hanging on the wall. After the sexual assault, they're able to describe this painting in exquisite detail, but they can barely describe the perpetrator, right? They don't really know what they look like, how tall they are, any of those identifying features that law enforcement might need to track them down. The painting is their central detail. The perpetrator is their periphery detail. It's important to keep in mind that central details are very resistant to change. However, peripheral details may fluctuate, and they're more likely to be influenced by leading questions. This is why it's really important to be trained in trauma-informed interviewing techniques if you're an investigator, and to always ask open-ended questions. It's impossible to predict what sexual assault victims will focus on and what they won't focus on. In addition to our focus, the parts of the brain that help us encode and store memories also become impaired during the trauma. The thalamus we talked about becomes impaired, and then we can't provide context to our sensations. The hippocampus, another part of the emotional brain, which helps us encode, consolidate, and store memories, also becomes impaired. Encoding memories is what helps us to add context, right? So we have a lot of different things blocking the context of memories. So what does this breakdown look like? During trauma, the hippocampus actually goes into overdrive and encodes memories very quickly. This explains why many survivors may have a lot of detail about the lead up and the initial moments of the sexual assault, but not the rest of it. This is actually called flashbulb memories. Our brains realize it's a dangerous situation, and they try to capture as much of it as possible so we can avoid it in the future. However, it doesn't really work out that way in reality. After the hippocampus goes into overdrive, it then switches to capturing, to consolidating everything, right? So while it's consolidating a ton of new information, it's not able to capture everything else that's happening. Victims may remember sounds, smells, bodily sensations, emotions that they were feeling, but they might not know the sequential order or the timing because the context is not encoded. So how did the survivor miss the fact that the perpetrator had a large face tattoo, right? Trauma memories are fragmented due to hippocampus impairment. People remember what they focus on best, and details not crucial to survival or to coping may be harder to remember. Remember, survivors need time to peel back layers of their memory. A useful metaphor for trauma memories is a puzzle that you got from a thrift store. I don't know about you, but I've gotten a few puzzles from thrift stores, and sometimes it's not always a good puzzle, right? Oftentimes the pieces are missing, they may be damaged. Sometimes the puzzle is sold in a plastic bag, right? And you don't even have the original box or the picture to know what it will look like in the end. Trauma memories are often like this, and it's really important to have patience. This is another reason that it's really important to have a couple sleep cycles before that detailed interview with law enforcement. All right, I want to pause now at the end of this section to find out if anyone has any questions that I may have missed. So one person has asked, what is trauma? And actually, we're going to get into a definition of trauma in about 4 slides. So I will hold that question for a little bit longer. I'm seeing a few people have their hands raised, so if you have a question, please put it in the chat or the Q&A. One person's asked, did you share if it's better for a couple of sleep cycles prior to meeting with law enforcement? Yes, so especially if it's an immediate report, it's best to have a few sleep cycles so that the body won't have those stress hormones flooding the body when they're also trying to tell law enforcement what's happened, right? Those stress hormones can make it very difficult for someone to remember what's happened. It can make it very difficult for someone to coherently speak about what's happened, right? And another thing to keep in mind is that when someone does share what's happened, those stress responses can also come back, right? So they may be triggered and re-traumatized, and so they might still have similar reactions. So it is very important to have that sleep cycle. All right. Should they still seek a medical evaluation immediately rather than waiting for the sleep cycles? Whether or not someone seeks a medical evaluation is really entirely up to them. I don't think it's a question of should or should they not do it. I think they should seek the medical evaluation when they are most comfortable doing so. Someone has asked, would you suggest waiting to have a forensic interview first before reaching out for therapy? Again, I think that is something that's entirely up to the survivor and what they want to do, right? The forensic interview is more related to how they may want to pursue a criminal justice response, and then a therapy, reaching out for therapy is more related to how someone may want to heal from the experience. So it's entirely up to what the survivor wants to do. Someone has asked, does the same sympathetic nervous system takeover occur when sexual abuse occurs to a very young child, since the brain is still developing? Absolutely, right? The sympathetic nervous system is part of the brainstem. And so, like I said, a newborn baby can do it. So the sympathetic nervous system will still respond in the same way for a very young child. And then there's a lot of research out there that we're not going to get into today. But when traumatic events to happen to very young children, it can affect the developing brain and the developing nervous system, right? That doesn't mean that someone can't heal from that. It just means that it can have a really strong effect. All right. So someone else has asked, if the victim is passed out or drugged, can I talk about what happens in that instance? Yes, so I think especially I'm going to talk about what happens with memory. So when and maybe the physical response. So when a victim's passed out or drugged, right, the physical response, they're already passed out. When it comes to memory, when there are drugs and alcohol in the system, even if there's not maybe enough to like black out, to be blackout drunk, that can still affect the hippocampus and all the memory systems in the brain. And so it can be even harder to remember what's happened when someone has drugs or alcohol in their system. So that's also really important to keep in mind. All right, thank you everyone for all the questions. I don't see any more coming in, so I'm going to move on to the next section. But if you still have questions, please put them in the question and answer box, and I'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation. All right, so now we're talking about the traumatic impact. After a sexual assault, people can experience a wide range of reactions, and this may be based on their previous experience. It may be based on the way they're wired neurochemically in their brain, right? It may be based on a wide variety of context. It's extremely important to note that there's no one pattern or order of responses, right? There's no one way to respond, and there are very, very many normal responses to trauma. Some people may respond immediately, right? They may have an immediate response to what's happened. Others have a delayed reaction, And others may be affected for a really long time compared to some other people. All right, I know someone in the chat asked what is trauma. So we're going to talk about that now. Trauma, we want to reframe our thinking, right? So all the things on the slide, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, child abuse, child sexual abuse, all of that, that's actually not trauma, right? Those are traumatic experiences for sure, but we want to shift our thinking so we can better understand trauma. Trauma occurs when the body experiences more than it can handle, right? So this is why like two people might have the exact same experience, right? They may be in the exact same car accident. And one person develops PTSD and the other person doesn't. So you'll remember that the autonomic nervous system controls our basic life functions like breathing, eating, digestion, and that it needs to be balanced between the parasympathetic nervous system, our cool brain, and the sympathetic nervous system, our hot, fight, flight brain. Trauma is the body's response to the sympathetic nervous system going into survival mode. When this happens, we go into fight, flight. Everything we just talked about happens. Right? We have that full body response, and the autonomic nervous system becomes out of balance and dysregulated. The autonomic nervous system will attempt to self-correct. We may become aggressive, irritable, or numb, for example. And over time, trauma and re-traumatization, like triggers or flashbacks, can cause the sympathetic nervous system to become more sensitive, right? Making it harder to know when we are safe and how to stay in balance and regulate our nervous system. And we can only heal from trauma when our autonomic nervous system is balanced and regulated. Because of this, it's really important for everyone who's working with survivors to be regulated themselves and to always work on self-regulation as part of your self-care routine. You cannot lead someone out of a fight or flight response unless you yourself are calm and cool. All right, we're gonna try to watch another video. So I hope this one works because this is actually a really good technique that those who work with survivors can use to stay regulated themselves.
And if we want to be healthy, we need to have a parasympathetically dominant.
All right, so I've been told it's not working. So I'm gonna try again with playing it on YouTube, because that might work better. All right. I'm really sorry for all of the audio problems that we're having today. We'll definitely try to figure out what's going on so that this doesn't happen in our future webinar. So I apologize for that. But in this video, she goes through a grounding technique to help stay regulated. And we can share it at the end because I think it's a really good one to use. And she does one of the grounding techniques that involves the senses. And if I'm remembering the video correctly, it's like name three things that you can feel, right? So like I can feel my desk. It's a little bumpy. It's that fake plastic bumpiness. I can also feel my ergonomic wrist pad, right? It's soft, it's a nice cushion for my wrists. And then I can also feel the smooth screen of my cell phone, right? And then she goes through a number of different senses that can be a really good grounding technique. So if you're in between working with different survivors and you need to reset yourself, that is a good technique that you can use. All right, so I have this quote on here: traumatized people feel chronically unsafe inside their bodies, from Bessel van der Kolk. And Bessel van der Kolk wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is a really, really great book that I would recommend to learn more about trauma and some of the impacts in the body. So now in the chat, I want you to type out what are some of the traumatic impacts from sexual violence that you've seen in your work. All right, someone said chronic pain, desire for anonymity, eating disorder, substance abuse, chronic PTSD, distrust of people, isolation, distrust, defensiveness, lifelong mental health problems, depression, PTSD, sleep problems, hypersexuality, hypervigilance, sleep problems, depression, isolation, anxiety, anger, physical problems, digestive issues, scattered thinking, high-risk behavior, suicidal ideation. Nightmares, re-traumatization during medical exams, loss of events from the day, addictions, rage, hiding, guilt, distrust, antisocial behavior, not knowing what's real. Yeah, these are all really great responses. I feel like you all have a wealth of experience working with survivors, and it really shows. All right. So I want to take a moment to talk about triggers. Right, what is a trigger? Survivors are often triggered because of perceived threats, right? So their brain is somehow reminded of the experience and then it thinks it's in danger, which engages that sympathetic fight-flight response all over again. For some, this may be even worse than the original experience itself because you can be triggered at any time. And if you're not familiar with what triggers you, you might not be expecting to be triggered. You might not know what's happening. Some people may experience flashbacks or relive their traumatic experience when they're being triggered, and others may not be aware that they're triggered. They might just be having some kind of reaction, right? Like they might feel like they're having some kind of emotional outburst for no reason, but it could be because they're triggered, and then they may need to figure out what is triggering them. an example, and someone mentioned in the chat that medical exams can be very triggering, right? And so one example that I've heard from a survivor is when their doctor tells them to just relax before a pelvic exam, right? And they were triggered by this because that's what their perpetrator said when they were raping them. Some possible triggers may be sensory experiences, like noises, smells, touch, sights, and sounds. Remember, during a traumatic event, our memories aren't encoded with context, right? So a lot of times people will get different sensory experiences that they might not even know are related to the sexual assault they experienced, but then they're triggered by them. Some people are triggered by dates and anniversaries. Interpersonal relationships may be triggering because sometimes interpersonal relations can activate that fight-flight response if there are power imbalances. So this is why it's important as advocates and those working with survivors to make sure that we're not creating power imbalances, right? And there's already a power imbalance just because of the relationship of a survivor and an advocate, right? There's an inherent power imbalance there. But we need to do our best to end the power imbalance and to make it as less as possible. So even if we think we know what is best, what the survivor should or should not do, or if there's like a referral we want them to take, we should never ever try to convince them to do something. We should never try to shame them into doing something, and we never should tell them what they should or should not do at all, right? Not only is this the exact opposite of empowerment advocacy, it can trigger and re-traumatize someone. The same neurological and chemical responses that happen during a traumatic event happen when someone is triggered. The fight, flight, collapse slides we went through, those happen again and again with many survivors. Some people may adapt to trauma with an action-oriented response, right? They may become angry, aggressive, defensive, impulsive, hostile, irrational, right? Others may mitigate the trauma and try to distance themselves from the trauma as much as possible. And so that can lead to freezing, dissociation, numbing out, using distraction techniques, self-soothing, addiction, and self-injury, all of those, right? None of these are good or bad. Those are all normal responses. And then when survivors use distancing responses, which is very, very common for a lot of survivors of sexual violence, they can actually begin to shut down the parts of their brains that are related to emotion and terror. The more someone distances themselves from their sensations, the less connected they are with their body. They may be unable to name emotions and feelings, but they may conceive of them as physical problems, but that don't have any medical cause. So for example, I don't know if any of you've seen, there's a new Netflix show that I really enjoyed called Never Have I Ever. And in that show, the main character actually temporarily loses feeling in her legs due to the trauma of her father's death. But there's no medical explanation for this, right? So that's an example of how she's become so distanced from her body that she starts to lose feeling in different parts of it. Now, in Never Have I Ever, it's a pretty extreme example, but this is actually not uncommon for survivors to experience to a lesser degree, right? Like sometimes people may lose feeling in the bottom of their feet, or they may lose feeling on their skin, and in different ways like that. That might not seem serious, but they can have a very strong impact. And this is why actually touch and touch therapy can be a really important tool for some survivors' healing. If someone can't comfortably notice what is happening in their bodies, they also become more vulnerable to sympathetic nervous system shifts and then suddenly shifting into fight flight mode, right? Their nervous system becomes more responsive when maybe we don't want it to be. If someone is uncomfortable noticing their bodies, they also may numb themselves further. However, even if it's ignored, the body will still react in some way. Some common impacts of sexual violence include physical impacts that seem unrelated to the experience. But remember at the beginning, we talked about the vagus nerve and how it's connected to a bunch of different body parts throughout our body, like our stomachs and our liver and our kidneys, right? There's a bunch of different parts of the body that it's connected to. And this can also help explain why these body parts are affected by the trauma when they seem to be unrelated, right? So some people may experience chronic pain. I know several of you mentioned that in the chat. Some people may experience fatigue or exhaustion, right? The brain centers that regulate our sleep cycle are also impacted by trauma. Some people may experience gastrointestinal disorders. Some experience migraines, other frequent headaches, eating disorders. I know a few of you mentioned substance use and dependence, right? Substance use is a way that people can regulate their nervous system, right? It's a way that people are finding to cope with a dysregulated nervous system. Sometimes it exacerbates pre-existing health conditions, or it can trigger health conditions that people are genetically predisposed to. Some survivors may struggle with suicidal thoughts. And again, I know some of you mentioned in the chat, there's an avoidance of healthcare on top of this, right? Healthcare can be very triggering for a lot of people. So survivors may avoid it. And then this can also exacerbate many of these physical impacts that people experience. Some survivors experience psychological impacts, and many of this can come from the re-traumatization as well as the initial event. And the nervous system, when we're re-traumatized and triggered, the nervous system becomes frequently dysregulated, which can make some of these impacts even worse, right? So people may experience blame and shame, right? They may blame themselves for what happened. They may be ashamed of their actions before, during, and after, right? Because we live in a society that often victim blames, many people internalize this and they blame themselves. People become irritable, right? So that's trying to adapt to that trauma. Some people numb out, like we've talked about. There's trouble sleeping. People struggle with nightmares. Hypervigilance, they're always feeling kind of paranoid or looking over your shoulder. One thing that happens in the brain is that the amygdala actually becomes larger when the stress response is activated frequently. And so that causes that hypervigilance to continuously occur. Depression, anxiety, and generally having fear, PTSD and flashbacks. I know someone in the Q&A, they asked, does PTSD always follow trauma? And I don't think it does, right? PTSD can happen to a lot of folks due to trauma, but it's not necessarily always going to happen, right? Everyone responds to trauma differently. And so some people may experience long-term chronic complex PTSD, and some people may not. Self-esteem is affected by trauma. Some people have difficulty with sex and sexuality, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. Some people experience hopelessness. And then another thing that happens is binary thinking. So sometimes trauma can lead our brains to think that there's only two options, right? And this can lead to irrational behavior or damage to relationships, right? So this could look like, if my house is not spotless, it's disgusting. And so then someone will compulsively clean their house. If someone doesn't love me, they hate me, which can lead to a breakdown in relationships. It could also lead to someone having this idea of, if I can put all my effort in, or I can put no effort in, that can explain why it might seem like the survivors you're working with aren't putting any effort in because they might have that thinking like they can either do all of it or none of it. There's a lot that someone may want to do or need to do following a sexual assault. And it's a lot, some of it's a lot of work. And that can be very, very overwhelming. And so if you put all your effort into it, you're overwhelmed. If you put no effort in, you're not overwhelmed. And then some people might develop like an us or them type thinking, right? So only someone with a similar experience can understand me. No one else can understand me. Sexual violence absolutely has an impact on sexuality. In our society, many of us have an unhealthy relationship with sex already, right? We're not taught about sex in school. We often learn through the relationships we have rather than being taught what's healthy and what's not healthy. And we also have gender roles, right? Gender roles impact how folks think about sex in general. Girls and women, they're taught to be not sexual, right? You're not allowed to be sexual. And then you're supposed to hide if sexual violence has happened to you. Whereas boys and men are taught to be sexual, and then they can't experience sexual violence because boys are supposed to be sexual all the time, right? They're always supposed to want to have sex. And then this can make it for everyone, make it difficult for everyone to talk about sex and sexual violence, to talk about healing from sexual violence, and it can impact how people respond, right? People may become fearful. They may think that they're damaged, right? That they can't have sex now. They may feel confused because maybe their response to sexual violence is that they become really hypersexual, and they're confused about why. Like, why is that happening? Like, they were never hypersexual before. They may feel stuck. They may have flashbacks during sex. It may be difficult for them to stay present during sex because there's a lot of things about sex, even consensual sex, that are triggering for folks. Some people may avoid sex and some people may become hypersexual. All of this is normal, and we shouldn't shame how anyone responds sexually to sexual violence, right? We shouldn't shame if someone becomes hypersexual. We shouldn't shame that. If someone doesn't want to have sex, we also should not shame that. Survivors may want to work on their sexuality, so it's important to be aware of this as advocates, but it's very, very important to never shame someone for their response. And then finally, there are many social impacts of sexual violence. This is important because social support is actually the most important protective factor against trauma. As humans, we have a need to be truly seen and heard, especially in regards to our trauma, right? If we don't feel like we're seen or heard, it's very difficult for our brains to process trauma and for us to heal from trauma. You'll remember when I talked about my near drowning experience, I called my mom, right? And I received strong social support from her, and I was able to feel a lot better. I even went back to the ocean the very next day. However, due to the stigma of sexual violence, this social support can oftentimes break down, and trauma also can impact the breakdown of social support. Survivors may isolate themselves, they may withdraw from their support system. Friends and family may turn on survivors, right? They might not believe them, or they might blame them for what happened, or they could even be the perpetrators, right? And then friends and family who are supportive, they may not feel equipped to support them, right? They may not understand what their role should be, or how they can support someone who's experienced sexual violence. Many survivors develop issues with concentration as well, which leads to struggles with work or school. And that can have impacts on those relationships. Like maybe you had a really good relationship with your boss before you experienced sexual violence, and then suddenly like you're not able to perform as well as work. Like your quality of work isn't as good because of all the trauma that you've experienced, and that could lead to a breakdown between your relationship with your boss. And then lastly, people may have difficulty relating with others. You'll remember at the beginning, we talked about mirror neurons in our rational brain, right, which allow us to feel empathy and to form connections with other humans. When we experience trauma, that impacts our mirror neurons, and we may feel out of sync with others. We may have a difficult time connecting with others. And it can break down our relationships and make us feel isolated, even if we're not physically isolated. All right, so I see a few questions. So one person says, when they're triggered and they have reactions which affect their presentation, which in turn can trigger further marginalization due to reactions in others, it's a vicious cycle, right? So I think what you're trying to say is, when someone's triggered and they react a particular way, if we're not expecting that kind of reaction, or we're not aware that that kind of reaction is connected to trauma, we can be very judgmental and concerned. And it doesn't help the situation, right? And I think this person also mentioned it causes further marginalization, right? So if someone has an oppressed identity, right? So and we can kind of tell that identity based on looking at them. We might judge their reaction further based on implicit bias that we have about their identity. And that can lead to a further traumatic cycle, which is absolutely true. Someone else says, has anyone ever known of a victim of sexual assault who was triggered during a consensual encounter or examination and later accused the consensual partner or examination of sexual assault? I think that's a difficult question. I'm not familiar with any cases like that. And I think it can be very tricky, right? And I think it's up to the survivor to determine what is and what is not consensual as well. Like, obviously in any sexual activity, both or all people need to consent. And sometimes when people are triggered, they may want to withdraw their consent and feel unable to do so. And so it could turn into an experience of sexual violence, right? So I think it's a very difficult situation. All right. So not only can sexual violence have long-term impacts on many aspects of a survivor's life, trauma can also affect someone's DNA. Stress hormones can actually activate different genes in the body, and a number of chronic illnesses have been associated with this, right? So we have some forms of cancer, and lupus are actually known to have a relationship with stress hormones. And so if you're predisposed in your genetics to have that kind of illness, you may develop that kind of illness after experiencing trauma. You may not, though. And these changes to our epigenetics can actually pass on to children, right? So it becomes generational and is passed down through genetics. Oppression is also proven to have traumatic impacts as well, because oppression, including microaggressions, is a form of trauma. Now, you may think that microaggressions are small, but someone does not need to experience a big traumatic event to experience trauma. Repeated smaller events also cause trauma. Additionally, experiences of oppression are a predictor of developing PTSD when someone does experience a big traumatic event. Some trauma researchers even consider oppression an independent developmental trauma, which is huge. Many of you might be familiar with the ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences, and the effects that ACEs have on people. All of those are developmental traumas, right? And we can see how developmental traumas have that profound impact on someone's life and well-being. So it's really, really huge that people consider, that trauma researchers consider oppression an independent developmental trauma. And this is one of the many reasons that we all need to have an understanding of oppression in our work, how oppression impacts survivors, and fight to end oppression in all that we do. Historical trauma is when populations experience mass collective trauma, such as genocide or slavery, and it's passed down through the generations, both in DNA and then from continued targeting of those groups. This is trauma at a community level, and it also has deep ramifications for the community and generations to come. This means that when someone experiences historical trauma, they can also experience traumatic impacts without directly experiencing the traumatic event itself. And it may also impact someone's direct experiences of traumatic events. Many of the communities that experience historical trauma, like the Native American community and the Black community, continue to experience oppression and trauma to this day. This past week, we've all seen how police violence continues to be perpetrated against the Black community, and the response to this community's peaceful protesting is more police violence when other communities are allowed to peacefully protest and not be subject to police violence. I have another video talking more about historical trauma, but I think I'm just going to skip it since we've had so many tech problems. So what does all this mean for working with survivors? So this can mean that survivors may miss appointments, right? They may be late to their appointments. They may have difficulty getting there for a variety of reasons, like lack of access to transportation, but they also may have issues with time management and scheduling, right? Because executive functioning is impaired with trauma. They may not return phone calls, or they may not follow up on referrals. Like, I have trouble following up on phone calls and referrals when I'm not in a traumatized state, just because I don't like doing that. And so when someone is experiencing trauma, that can be even more difficult. People may be financially strained. Experiencing trauma and experiencing a crime can have a ton of financial impact, right? I think it's estimated that a survivor of sexual violence will be impacted, I think it's like $102,000 over their life. That's how much money they're gonna have to spend because of their experience. And some people may just wanna avoid it, right? I don't wanna deal with this today. I don't have the energy to deal with this today. But those of us who work with survivors, we need to make sure that we don't give up on working with survivors. We want to be compassionate. We want to make accommodations, right? We need to know the neurobiology of trauma and how trauma affects someone so that we can make accommodations to this person's unique experience. And we also want to be conscious of their needs. And remember that even though we may be working with many different survivors, that the traumatic event that this person has experienced is unique to them. And for that survivor, it was the crime of the century, right? We don't want to compare what they experienced to someone else, just because what they experienced in our minds might be less severe than what someone else experienced, doesn't mean that their trauma is not less severe. Right? It doesn't mean that their trauma is less important. And if we're making comparisons, that's a time that we need to recognize where we need to step back. We need to work on our own self-care and self-regulation. We might want to tag one of our coworkers to step in. And then remember, it's not your role as an advocate to assess or diagnose disorders, right? We may see things that we're like, this is not healthy, this person has a mental illness, but that's not our role. And just because someone experiences trauma and they're having a normal reaction to trauma doesn't mean that they're having a mental illness. We also want to refer survivors to a therapist as requested or as needed. All right, I want to take another break for questions. So one person's asked, can trauma be considered a disability? And for that, I'm not sure if you're asking like in general of like what can and cannot be considered as a disability, or if you mean in terms of being able to get like disability Social Security or being defined as a disability under the government. So I'm not sure which you're asking. And as far as being considered a disability under the government, I'm not 100% sure on that. So I can look that up after the training and let you know if you want to send me an email. As far as it being considered a disability, many of the impacts of trauma can be considered a disability. So I think it would be reasonable to think that trauma can be considered a disability. So another person has asked, how common is resistance to or distrust of therapy therapists, and what can be done to help that? So as far as how common, like percentage-wise, I don't know the answer how common the distrust is, but I do know that if someone is not regulated, right, if they're in fight flight mode or hot brain mode, that distrust is going to be elevated. And so something that can be done is making sure that you yourself are regulated and you yourself are in that calm and cool state. And then you can do different things with that client. I'm not a therapist, so I would recommend taking training that is specifically for therapists, because I'm not going to be able to give you any useful information for like how therapists can build trust with their clients. All right, I see a few people have raised their hands, so please type your question in the Q&A or in the chat. How can a compassionate advocate how can a compassionate advocate also assist a survivor to prepare for operating in real life, like getting to appointments on time, showing up for appointments? That's a really good question. And we're going to talk in the next section about healing options. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as advocates is to provide tools for self-regulation, right? So we can practice self-regulation, and then we can teach survivors self-regulation. And so we'll get into more of what that looks like. And then you can also, for showing up to appointments and work and that sort of thing, you can be their advocate in those environments as well, right? So maybe a survivor is struggling showing up to appointments. If you all have the capacity, right, with your workload, medical advocacy can go beyond going to forensic exams, right? You can do a medical accompaniment for other types of appointments as well. You can also strategize with survivors in advance of what do they need to feel safe in that appointment. And I think we have some tools on our website about ways to do that. And if I'm wrong, I think we either have some already or we've been working on some tools. But it can be things like, what information do you need this doctor to know about you to feel safe, right? Do you need this doctor to know that you're a survivor of sexual violence? Do you need this doctor to know that you have trauma? And do you want this doctor to know what it looks like when you're triggered? And like kind of thinking through those possible avenues. You can, survivors can bring a support person to appointments, right? So this could either be you as the advocate could be the support person, or they could have a friend who can help advocate for them during the appointment, right? Because sometimes at different appointments, people might not feel like they can advocate for themselves, and not everyone's trained to recognize trauma. So just making different strategies can help. You could also role play with a survivor, like say you as the advocate, you're role playing as the doctor, and the survivor is role playing as themselves, and you can role play like what it can look like when you go to an appointment. And someone else has recommended that you can ask the survivor what she can do and process and how she can remember her appointments, right? And so I think those strategies are going to look different for everyone, and finding what works for the survivor can be a joint effort between you and the survivor. And Lindsay posted that a handout is coming soon on strategizing around this. All right. Are there any more questions before we move on to healing? All right, I'm not seeing anything coming in, but there'll be time at the end for more questions. So what does all this neurobiology, what does all this brain stuff mean for healing? So healing's different for everyone. In general, healing for sexual violence may include learning how to not become overwhelmed by the trauma in both body and mind. It may look like getting in touch with your body, right? Becoming comfortable with your body and its sensations, like learning to notice your bodily feelings, learning to notice what maybe they mean, and learning to be comfortable with that, right? Because if we're uncomfortable, we might go into fight-flight mode. Another thing it may include is learning to be in the present, right? Sometimes, especially for folks who struggle with PTSD, they're stuck in a flashback or they're stuck in a memory. And so learning to be in the present and recognizing that a flashback or a trigger, it will pass, it's time bound, and you're still in the present and that you're safe. That can be very important for many survivors. And then another thing that can be important is integrating traumatic memories, right? So this is your brain reprocessing and reorganizing your memories so that the trauma can become something that happened to you and not something you're constantly reliving. When it comes to reintegrating memories, this is really the role of a therapist or counseling services. It's not the role of the advocate to do this. And so if survivors you're working for are expressing interest in learning how to deal with their memories or learning how to kind of cope in that way, you'll want to refer them to a therapist. So what is the role of the advocate? And we kind of briefly touched on this, but it's letting survivors know that healing looks different for everyone. There are many different avenues that someone can take, and there's no one way to heal, and there's no right way to heal. Your role is to provide a non-judgmental and shame-free space. Remember, feeling listened to and feeling heard and feeling seen are some of the most important things that we can experience as humans, especially related to trauma. Fostering a positive relationships with someone can be really hopeful, right? So remember how our mirror neurons become impaired? That breaks down our relationships. And so being able to foster a relationship with one person like an advocate can work to start strengthening those neurons again and can be really positive for advocates or for survivors whose relationships have been breaking down. It's important to explore different healing options with survivors. So becoming familiar with what's available, what resources are available in your community for healing, what resources in general work for survivors, and then also different techniques like self-regulation tools, right? So providing those different options. Again, providing self-regulation tools can be some of the most important things that you can do. So we're gonna get into what that can look like. So I have this quote, because I know if you attend our trainings frequently, especially the sexual violence trainings, we often talk about how listening, active listening is our most important tool, right? And this quote really proves how it's actually related to the neurobiology of trauma, and listening affects our brains really profoundly. Feeling listened to and understood changes our physiology. Being able to articulate a complex feeling and having our feelings recognized lights up our limbic brain and creates an aha moment, right? So feeling listened to impacts the emotional brain and can start that healing process. I think that's amazing. All right, we're going to talk about some of those regulation techniques. And there are a few different ways to regulate the nervous system that are useful to survivors. One is top-down regulation. So top-down regulation is really about strengthening your mind's capacity to monitor your bodily sensations. It's strengthening your rational brain, right? So it's making your brain better at knowing what is happening to your body and why, right? So if we know what we feel in our body, we may be able to understand why, right? So for example, I often experience feelings in my gut. So I might have a gut feeling about someone or something. But if I sit with that feeling, I might be able to figure out why I have that gut feeling, right? I like to call that intuition. I like to call my gut feelings intuition, but usually there's a real reason as to why I have a gut feeling, right? So like maybe I meet a new person and I just have a gut feeling about them. Like, I don't like this person. Like what, I just have this feeling. And then I sit with this feeling for a little bit and I realize that I have this feeling about this person because there's just something about their manner. There's something about the way they look maybe, or their style, and it could be anything. There's something about them and it reminds me of a friend I used to have who really hurt me, right? And so I have a gut feeling that I don't like this person because they remind me of this friend. They are not this person. They're completely different from this person, and I have no rational justification for disliking this person, right? And so once I've realized this, I'm able to separate this gut feeling I have from this new person I've just met. And that can be profound for judging someone new, for building new relationships with people. And so that's one of the ways that recognizing our feelings in our body can affect how we live in the world. It is important to note that noticing sensations in the body can be triggering for some survivors, right? So because sexual violence is something that happens to bodies, it can be extremely triggering sometimes. And so I want you to know this so that when you are potentially teaching survivors some of these methods, that they're aware they could become triggered and you're aware they could become triggered, and that you can appropriately handle that situation. And if you don't feel comfortable with that, then maybe you can refer them to a therapist who is more comfortable teaching them these techniques. So some examples of top-down regulation are mindfulness, right? So things like meditation, and being in the present, right? There's a ton of different apps that are available that survivors can download that can guide them through mindfulness and meditation exercises. And so you can refer some of those as well. Another really, really profound regulation technique is yoga. So I have yoga here as a top-down regulation. It's also going to be a bottom-up regulation technique. I have a video about yoga that I'm going to skip as well today. And I encourage you all to watch it when you have a chance. But it's Bessel van der Kolk talking about yoga. And essentially, in his work, he's done research on yoga and the effects that yoga has on trauma. And they've actually found that yoga is more, in different studies, those who did yoga had more impacts on healing their trauma than those who just did talk therapy and those who did medication, right? So yoga was more effective at treating trauma than some traditional therapy methods. And so that was really, really profound. And I think trauma-informed yoga is something that is becoming more and more widely available across the country. So I think that's really, really exciting. He also talks about martial arts. as being a different way to regulate. So things like Kung Fu and Tai Chi are really powerful ways that someone can relearn how to be in touch with their body and relearn how to be aware of their body. So bottom-up regulation, on the other hand, is about resetting our autonomic nervous system, right? So top-down is strengthening our mind's ability to like be aware of our body, and bottom-up is resetting the nervous system. It's what helps us leave fight or flight mode when we become triggered, and it changes our brain to become less likely to shift into fight-flight mode, right? So this is like really tapping into that neuroplasticity we talked about. So we're trying to rewire the brain to be less sensitive to triggers. And we're trying to change our brain and body's physiology. And this, it might sound like that's not something we can do, but it is. And it's also things that we do every day and that we can incorporate into our self-care practices. So one of these is breathing. Right, breathing is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. And so it becomes a great way to reset the nervous system when it's dysregulated. And so there's like a whole explanation of why this is important based on the science. Because I'm a nerd, I think that's super cool. But it can also be really confusing. The main thing that we want to do is focus on the out breath, right? So when we do breathing exercises, we want to see if we can make the out breath longer than the in breath, because the out breath is really what activates us to calm down and to get into that cool brain space, right? And so I have this video does not have sound, so I think it'll work, but I just want to invite you all to breathe with me. And there's a dot on the screen that will inflate, and when it gets bigger, that's when we breathe in, and when it gets smaller, that's when we breathe out. And I want you to focus on your out breath. So when you're breathing out, I just want you to focus on that. And I also want you to be compassionate. I think sometimes we get intimidated by breathing because it's like, I can't breathe in for more than 4 seconds, or I can't breathe out for more than 4 seconds. And like that lung capacity can be challenging. That's okay if you are done breathing in before the circle is full, that is totally fine. Just be compassionate, and it takes practice. And I would recommend doing breathing exercises every day so that you're familiar with what they look like, and that'll strengthen your ability to do them, as well as teach others to do them. So I invite you all to breathe with me. So breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Breathe in. Hold. And breathe out. And don't forget to focus on the breathing out. One more time. Breathe in. Hold. And breathe out. All right, thank you for breathing with me. So some other bottom-up regulation techniques are movement, right? So movement can be things like dance and exercise, right? And yoga. Another thing can be touch. So when we talked about people disconnecting from their body, sometimes touch and therapies revolving around touch can be really important. So like a trauma-informed massage therapist can help someone relearn what it feels like to be touched and what it means to be touched. And then I have yoga here again because it's just that good. It's both top down and bottom up. All right, and finally, we also want to attune to others. So remember those mirror neurons. We want to strengthen the mirror neurons so that we can strengthen our ability to feel empathy. and we can relearn how to form relationships with each other, because this is so important due to the social support being that huge protective factor for trauma. So doing group activities, especially rhythmic activities like dance and music, can be really, really helpful to learn how to be in sync with each other, right? Like if we are in a group where we're singing, we have to all listen to each other so that we're on the right key, we're harmonizing correctly, all of that. If we're dancing with each other, we need to be in tune and in sync with each other. And then a theater is another option for that, right? If we're doing theater, again, we need to know timing, we need to know when we're supposed to come out on stage, and we can also, that also strengthens our imagination, which can also be really powerful for healing from trauma. So remember, the healing process is best described as a spiral. Survivors go through the stages once, sometimes many times, sometimes one order, sometimes in another. Each time they hit a stage again, they move up the spiral. They can integrate new information and a broader range of feelings, utilize more resources, take better care of themselves, and make deeper changes, right? It's not linear, it's a spiral. All right. So I have some resources for you today. So here are some resources that you can check out. The Body Keeps the Score, the Arizona Trauma Institute. There's a number of webinars out there about the neurobiology of trauma. And then AVAWI and Violence Against Women International has also a number of neurobiology of trauma resources. So one person has said, self-defense classes are very empowering, and I realize they can actually help train you to have an automatic defense response. Yeah, and that's very true. So when we train our bodies in different ways, our bodies learn that we can respond in those ways. It doesn't mean that we will, because our bodies will still default to the way that the brain functions. But that can definitely help. One person says, what recommendations do you have for the medical provider in a hospital setting to provide trauma-informed care for both men and women, especially for patients experiencing medical emergencies? So I think when someone experiences a medical emergency, that physical safety does need to be attended to first. But as far as trauma-informed care goes, I think just being transparent, being informative of like what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it, and then also asking for consent at every step of the process is really important for medical care, right? Like, so in some medical emergencies, you may not have time to do all of that, but if you do, I would really recommend just explaining everything and asking for consent as much as you possibly can do. Someone else has asked, does a 12-step program heal trauma? I'm going to say I don't know. I'm not familiar with 12-step programs at all, really. So I can't answer that, but I can look into it. And I think for some people, they can absolutely be very helpful. Another person asked, does spirituality come into healing? And I think yes. So obviously it depends on the person, right? We would never want to try to impose a religion on someone if they don't believe that religion. But I think for a lot of different people, there's a spiritual impact that they can feel because of trauma, and then there might be some healing that they want to do with their spirituality that can be really powerful. So I think yes, but we'd never want to impose on anyone.